Good afternoon. It's an honor to stand in front of you here. It was 15 years ago I had my honeymoon in Iceland. You might find that funny because most honeymoons go to warmer places, but my wife was from Scotland and I had to provide a wilder example, and I couldn't think of a better place than Iceland, and it was pretty good. 3 weeks, the road one. Coming into Iceland yesterday, actually there were no clouds above Iceland. Maybe that's a good sign for growth of Iceland. And I could see Vatnajökull, Hekla, the Blue Lagoon, and of course Reykjavik in the distance. It's just a beautiful country. And clearly that's one of the growth factors that you have. Tourism has been growing for you. Since I want to talk about growth today, it's maybe useful if I calibrate myself a little bit in terms of how I think. Because growth is a forward-looking venture. How I think forward-looking might influence how I talk and what I say. The first thing I want to say is my knowledge is grounded in studying things, but it's also flying around the world. In the time that I led our strategy practice over the last 7 years, I probably went to 50 countries, 250 cities. My daughter summarizes that life as 730 meters above the planet, and that's roughly how it feels. But it's a beautiful place at the moment. The world is moving in many, many places. Some of the biggest events in technology are occurring. Some of the biggest events in developing economies are occurring right now. And the only thing I can say from flying around is I remain an optimist. So everything I say today comes from an optimist. If you're a pessimist, you might have to taper what I say a little bit, but I believe a country like Iceland can grow. I think it's actually useful if it grows, and I'd like to make that point. And if you think about the world being a place that's growing, Iceland should find ways to attach even more to it, and then you will just be lifted by the big boat called the world. Before I get into a little bit of a presentation, could you just think for one moment of what's the biggest trend on the planet? Biggest trend on the planet. Everybody has something in mind? The things I used to hear is, social networking, demographics, urbanization, technology, and they're all true. But I will contend that the biggest trend on the planet is the trend that adds all of the other trends up, which is GDP. GDP for the last 100 years in the world has grown 3% in real terms per annum. It has gone up and down. We've had a crisis, and yes, recently we had one too. But it was 3% for 100 years, and there is no reason, this is the optimist talking, that it wouldn't do another 3% for the next 100 years. And today's growth rate in the world in real terms is 3.8% as IMF just is forecasting for 2014. So, it's even slightly above that. Now, I'll do the calibration on the optimist. Some people, when I do this presentation, I talk about another 100 years of 3% growth, say, well, hang on, that doesn't work because the world is full. If I fly over Iceland, I would say that's not true for Iceland, for sure. But the second point I would like to make, that comment only comes in 3 places in the world. Western Europe, East Coast, West Coast US, and coastal Japan. Not in any other place in the world does anyone think the world is full. And that's important, because if you believe the world is full, you could start thinking, let's not grow, and it's all complicated and so on. One way we know that the world is not full is that the demographic trends, and demographics for the world is in many ways destiny, the demographic trends are such that it is quite likely or almost certain that we will end up with about 10 billion people on the planet. And we're ending up there. It's slowing down. And the best way we know that is that the number of children in the world is no longer rising. It's 2 billion at the moment. It's stopped at 2 billion already for 5 years. And if you think of another way that we might be full because all the people are going to eat more or something like that, or consume more, and therefore we have too little land. One other optimism statement is that the world 4 years ago has reached peak land, i.e. the world is giving land back to nature. And that is because agricultural productivity has had a revolution, and that revolution has allowed the world to basically produce more food and more things with less land. Over the last 5 years, the world has given 1 Ohio back to nature. Then you could say, well, we're short water. Then I would like to remind all of you that when we flew to the moon and somebody made the first picture of the Earth, how did we call Earth? The blue planet. Because that's the one molecule that the world is not short of is H2O. The other molecule we're not short of is aluminium. There's a little bit of competition between scientists which molecule is most prevalent on the Earth. The water problem is an energy problem. We have enough water, you just need to bring it to the desert and some other places where people have chosen to live. But it's not a water problem, it's an energy problem. And the good thing is, and your country has a lot of it, energy is also not short. We just need to get better at converting, for example, solar energy and other things, and geothermal and so on. So the optimist in me says, there's a lot of growth ahead. And for a country like Iceland, which is small in that entire world, I would contend it needs only a few anchors into that big ocean, and you will basically pull by the tide. And the conversation today is, in addition to domestic growth, resource growth that you've been doing, could you up your game in international growth? And by throwing out an anchor to this big ocean of growth that the world has, grow faster than a one-ish or a two-ish, but you could get 3 or 4. And there's some more factors that play into that. So this is about unlocking Iceland's growth potential. This is, of course, in the tradition of the report that we worked on the Icelandic economy, which was focused on the productive capacity of the Iceland economy. We make many of these reports about countries because we like to help countries in their thinking about how they grow. I'm glad to hear, in being in Iceland today and yesterday, that this report has led to conversation, and I hope it will continue to lead to conversation about growth, because growth, I think, is important for countries. Now, growth is, of course, just one way that you measure that a country is making progress. You would want productivity, you want inclusiveness, you want sustainability, you want resilience, you want connectivity. You don't want to waste resources, so you want to be productive with resources. You want everybody to participate. You want it to do sustainable without pollution. You want to be resilient so you don't hit a crisis. You don't want too many bubbles that then burst, and we have all seen how that life is. And it needs to be connective, not just in the world, but also in the country. Now, the good news is all these 5 or other broader goals that you have almost invariably are easier when you grow. So that's why I feel quite comfortable to talk about growth only while I have these broader goals in mind. Some people say, you need to educate first and then you get growth. Reality says causality goes both ways. When countries can get richer, they can pay for education. Sustainability, same point. People say Shanghai is dirty. Shanghai is damn dirty at the moment. Actually, I think you should not live longer than 2 months per year in Shanghai at the moment. But above 5,000 GDP per capita, they will clean it up. And that's what has happened in the Western world also. So these things get better also with growth. But they are, of course, in a way more important objectives than just the growth in itself. Growth you do with a purpose, not just for growth's sake. You could look at the growth potential of Iceland in 3 frames. Now, you could look at the domestic services sector, non-tradable goods and services, and drive productivity and resource allocation to the best places that you can get growth and get the maximum out of labor and capital that goes in those sectors. And then you can free up capacity also by being more productive to do other things. You can work on the resource-based sector. You have fishing, you have energy, and we've classified tourism in this too, because basically the tourists come for your resource, which is your beautiful island. In a way, of course, they come and bring money and buy stuff. They also export your beauty, but it's in here, resource-based sector. And there you want to get the maximum value out of the limited resources that even Iceland has. And then, you can produce tradable goods and services that the rest of the world would like to buy from you. and therefore enable growth to having competitive industries, competitive tradable goods industries, competitive services industries can help you. So the focus today, because other work that has focused on the other two, will be on the international sector. But before I go there, a little bit more of a set of numbers on these three frames of growth for Iceland. So clearly the biggest proportion of GDP in Iceland currently comes from the domestic services sector, of which 380 billion kroner is public, 770 is private. The workforce in there is also, with 50 and 70,000, the biggest piece of your workforce. And a substantial amount of capital goes in there, and it's not exporting. That's the definition of the domestic sector, and you would focus on productivity there. If you look at the resource-based sector, it contributes a nice chunk of GDP, with quite a few people compared to the amount of GDP, but a lot of capital. So, the capital returns of this are a little bit less at the moment than the capital returns of the domestic sector. And it does generate a lot of exports. The international sector at the moment is the smallest chunk of your economy, has also 25,000 people in the workforce, moderate amounts of capital, and of course it's almost all exports, because that's the international segment. And you might want to work each of these differently towards productivity in the first, value in the second, and increase the volume in the third, because every volume in export comes, will help that segment. Just want to make one example. I'm not going to focus on the resource-based sector, but you have cheaper energy than the rest. If you could just throw one anchor out into the economy, it would be a pipeline of energy to the UK, for example. The UK is likely going to be the biggest economy in Western Europe in a 10-year time frame, might even surpass Germany, because the aging effect in Germany is quite substantial. If you just could attach to that 3% growth on the energy side, pure profit would come in, with which you could do many other things, which is just the arbitrage between your price and their price. But I'm not saying this is the answer, but I'm just thinking about if you could attach what you do more to the international world, you can be pulled by the growth that is happening in the rest of the world. And a small island attaching to a big ocean, a big piece of growth in the world, it's quite easy to pull. You don't need to have a big rope to the UK to get quite a massive pull. And that's just one little example, but there will be more, and we'll talk about it in the international sector. Historically, you had the tendency to run a current account deficit, i.e. import more than you export. That is not necessarily the standard model for smaller countries. And many smaller countries in, for example, the EU would more show 30 to 40% exports, and then the current account deficit would more often be a surplus. So the export discussion that I'm having could help here. Extended periods of trade deficits have occurred. The capital transfer balances that, but it's 7% of GDP, so it's not a small number, it's a sizable number. Now recently this story of course has flipped because the currency and the controls around that basically have led to a positive trade balance. But as you can see where imports are going, the trade balance is coming down. And in a way you could say another reason why to focus on this international sector is that through the international sector and the exports, you actually earn the right to import. And the stuff that you don't have, that you would like to have. So with better exports, you will have more rights on the imports of the things that you would want to bring to the economy. So exports would contribute to that too. So we modeled a little bit, and this was just shown in the previous speech. If you assume, tourism, and fishing not to be the biggest growth industries, the international sector plus new exports would have to drive a lot if you wanted to have a big step in the economy. We're talking here and modeling here with getting another trillion from that, which would support a 3% GDP per capita growth. GDP growth could then still be higher in a positive scenario because you would also have some capita increase if you would have immigration one way or the other, which is a separate discussion. But per capita, with a number like this and the other sectors doing what they're doing, you could actually get to 3%. So the question is, can that be done? And I'm going to sketch that a little bit and have a little bit of a discussion around that in the subsequent pages. Now, this depends a little bit on how much you could do, for example, in the resource-based sector. If the more you do in the resource-based sector, the less you would have to do in this international sector. So we would go with the moderate resource growth scenario in the middle, where a significant chunk of new exports would have to be derived, $500 billion or something like that. But you could vary that based on your own taste of what you think the resource sector could be doing. But invariably, even in the most right-hand side center, a significant chunk of new exports would have to come to, get to the 3% GDP per capita. Now, in the limited resource growth, you would have the tourism slowing down, power generation grows, but energy prices remain low, and fishing is unchanged. In the high resource growth, tourism would grow continually fast, maybe as it picked up in the last 2 years. Power generation would be integrated with other markets with an interconnector, and you get that lift, the UK anchor that I talked about, and the fishing value would increase. And in the middle, you would be somewhere in between. So you can have your own guess of what Iceland can do with the resource sector, but even in the extreme case, you would benefit from the international sector to increase in exports to hit that 3% growth. Now, the way I just said that, hit 3% growth, is 3% growth a target in itself? In many discussions that I have with governments, politicians, but also the general public in European countries, in Western European countries, they come back, why 3%? Doesn't matter, why not 2, why not 1, why not 0? And I think this is an important discussion. The reason why 1 might not be enough in the kind of demographics that we have and the kind of growth that we have and the healthcare cost and stuff that comes with that is at 1%, it's invariably the case that the next generation in a Western European country will be poorer than the previous generation. Today, in some European countries, you already see that the current generation, if you look to the pensions, is getting poorer today. Now, we could all say that's good, there was just one generation that had a great life, and the next, I have personally, this is the optimism in me, I say that's not necessary to think that way, because you could do 3, but the other thing is, I actually think it's something that you should aspire to, that your kids, do better than your previous generation. But 1% is not enough either. If you look historically, the prevalence of poverty in rich countries, which is the bottom quintile, has only reduced at 2% growth. Actually, you need a lot of growth to get the bottom up, and there's no transfer you can do, just tax the rich and give it to the poor, that will fix that equation. And by the way, the tax the rich, give it to the poor doesn't work in low-growth environments. It happens in low-growth environments, but it stifles growth even more. So there is something around at least a bottom of 2. And then, with inspiration, I think you could get it to 3. If you, by the way, think this is impossible, one way to look at the world is not by looking at countries, but looking at cities. And I have worked on reports that have described the world's growth in 600 cities. 600 cities will drive 60% of the world's growth going forward. And I'm not going to do what I do often in these speeches, but I will read all 600 to you. And then I would ask, who of you, could you just check mark, do you know the town, have you been there? And then I would do a poll of hands, who of you knows more than 200 of them, and all of them I would take their dinner. I've done this in groups with 500 people, and I had to pay 2 dinners. Because 200 of these cities are in China, 220 are in Western nations, and so the rest is in Latin America and Africa. But the majority of these towns are small. They are actually as big as Reykjavik. And they're on the way from Reykjavik size to 2 million, from Reykjavik size to 5 million. That's the towns where the world's growth occurs. I'm not saying you should go to 2 million, but if you were to have that ambition, the 3% would be very easy. You won't have to deal with, I'm not saying that that's what the answer is, but just that's what's happening in the world. In the world, cities of your size, Reykjavik here, or even the entire nation, basically have this massive growth. And so somewhere the population part is important too. If you calculate with this 500 million, so the middle scenario for export growth, that would take 300 in capital and a productivity increase that would have to go with that, and it would create 20,000 jobs. So it would double the number of jobs that would be related to the export sector. That's a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation. But it just suggests that not only it's on the money side, it's also material to the workforce. Another way to show that is it would take 40 marels. You're going to speak after me, Arnie. So just, there's a target here. 50 Osiers, 80 CCPs, 320 minigas. Of course, not all the same. But, it's reasonable work to get to that point, and it needs to be done. So, the plan that is behind getting these exports has to be quite substantial. And that's what I would like to talk next. Before I go in each of these 4 steps, I actually like to do a little bit of a show of hands to just, get you a little bit alive around these 4 questions. The first one would be, do you think Iceland has the facts on the table on what it should do to reach the growth path that I sketched? Could I get a raise of hands who thinks you have the facts on the table? Not yet. Okay, good. Who thinks you don't have them at all? Now everybody else needs to go. This is still 50-50, so I'll do this again because you didn't raise the hands. There was too few hands to actually get a call of the vote. Who thinks the facts are on the table? Who thinks they're not? I think it's not yet on the table, okay? So that's important. Number 2, I'm going to not ask what the goal should be now. I will do that in a moment. The first question I want to ask is, what do you think the implicit goal or explicit goal of the Icelandic community is? What are you shooting for at the moment? What's the implicit goal for economic growth? Who thinks it's below 0? Good. Who thinks it's between 0 and 1? Who thinks it's between 1 and 2? Who thinks it's between 2 and 3? Who thinks it's above 3? So there's no below 0, which is good. I think the peak was between 2 and 3. So without facts, you said 2 and 3. That's pretty good. And I think 3, there were still a few hands, so there's some optimism to work with. Do you think you have a plan to get to 2 or 3, or 2 to 3, or above 3? Who thinks the plan is ready? Could you come up here? There was one hand, so you all probably know who he is and why he puts his hand up, but because this is, of course, a small community. But so you could have a discussion now whether should the country have a plan. You could also say no, it's just all the market economy, and or should there be some sort of direction? And I will contend, it's helpful to have a little bit of a plan, at least some idea. Given that there was only one hand of plans that says a plan, I'm not sure I should ask the next question, because that would be, are you implementing the changes that would link with the plan? But it's good you have a goal. I would say the way you voted that the implicit goal of Iceland is higher than it is in the rest of Western Europe. The implicit goal in most Western European economies is, in my view, between 1 and 1.5. Now, I told you you have to be above 2, so I'm not 100% sure when you came into this meeting you had the same opinion as what you just voted, but you just think about that yourself. But But it's useful to think about, if your goal is 2 to 3, that your plan has to work back from 2 to 3. And you do quite different things when your plan is a 2 to 3 goal than if your plan is a 1 to 2 goal or even below 1. So let's go through that. Elements on getting the facts on the table. Driving growth of the international sector, of course, would have to deal with the capital controls. There's something around debt, of course. You need to have a long-term ownership structure that people can play into. You need to enable both volume and value-driven growth, so foster scale to create larger companies. On average, our statistics show bigger companies drive more value. Attract international capital and labor to help you build the scale. Strengthen the domestic labor pool through educational reforms. Address gaps in venture capital to build on emerging clusters. And my guess is that if you were to write down which one each of these have, might not all have the same view, but you would actually get quite close to what these elements are. You would know what kind of companies, you would know what kind of sectors, you know that the capital controls over time, something has to happen to it, and so on. So this could indeed be the reason why you say, the facts in some ways are on the table on what needs to be acted on, which is the what. The plan part, of course, is the how, which is always a little bit more complicated than the what, and that's, I think, also what you voted. This is maybe just a simple way to say, maybe this is what you should remember. If you want 3% and you believe what we just said on the other sectors, exports could need a plus trillion. So maybe just your goal of 2 to 3 fits, this page that we had here. But it's useful to actually make something quite simple. And this is the simple one that we suggested. With your 2 to 3, you're actually quite close to this. But it also means exports. This will not come only from domestic. And I think that's the next piece. One thing that's interesting when you discuss the how, and this is both in business as well as in government and in politics, if you discuss individual elements of the how, you get lots of no's. Because people need to change, people don't like to change. So if you were to propose, shall we raise taxes? My guess is, show of hands, low. Shall we move the pension age from, I don't know what it is here, but let's say from 60 to 65, and we'll do it tomorrow? Lots of no's. Shall we move the education system to a full meritocracy as it is now in Shanghai, including all the consequences for the current teachers? No. And and it can go on. Shall we implement the healthcare system that Singapore has? And shall we do it tomorrow? No, because that's all. You get lots of things that make sense. Get a no at the individual measure because they have some sort of short-term change pain. The way we think you could play with this is actually to say, give people the trade-off. So you say, option A, 1% growth means the next generation is going to be poorer off than this generation. Then there's no short-term pain. Why don't you just, do limited structural change? It can all sort of dabble on. But the consequence of dabbling on is the next generation is going to be poorer because you're going to have 1%. Then you can go, 3% growth, and this is total growth, including immigration. That's why there's 4% on the rest. The growth should be similar to neighboring countries, and it requires significant reforms in key areas. And you can go aggressive reforms and even be an innovation leader in certain things you do. We have, in several countries, done polls with society. In my country, for example, with 400,000 participants. If you frame individual measures, you always get a no. 70-30 is against. No. Should we up immigration? No. Should we do this? No. 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 You do the package, you get a yes. Because people, without understanding what you get back for it, will never vote for single measures. And I think when you think about making a plan, it's worth giving a package deal. I don't know whether you have a central planning agency in which the political parties in front of an election need to hand in their plan and they get a calculation back, what the likely growth is of the political plan. Do you have one of those? Okay, but in Europe, in many countries, they exist. So what happens is before the election, the political parties need to hand in a growth plan. Yeah? And that plan gets calculated. The funny thing is, because they roughly know how the algorithms work and so on, no matter whether they're left-wing, right-wing, blue, orange, or green, all the plans in Europe end up at 0.8 to 1% growth. That's it. Because there are no package deal fundamental reforms on average in these plans. At best, there's one fundamental reform, so it moves it from the left to the right. And literally, there's not a single, and I've looked at this, not a single place where these submissions happen, where actually the outcome of that is 3%. Is that now a mistake of the politicians? In my view, it's not. They represent the vote that they can get. And as long as the rooms like this don't help the society to say we need to articulate a different answer, they are in a box in which they need to play. That's at least the view that I've seen in several places. And that's why they hand in plans that don't have too many structural reforms, because the structural reforms get the no's. It's a complex journey to get a country onto a different growth path in the plan side. But I'm sure this is going to lead to some discussion in the Q&A. We would say that if you want export growth, which is industry-led, there are two things that you need to work on as a country. One is, what industries do you stand for? Now, which ones are you going to favor? Because you can easily say, we have 25 industries playing in my country, and we'll just give them all something. That's not how Silicon Valley was created. Not saying that you should create Silicon Valley, but that was not by saying, we want food industry, this, that, and that. No, we want high tech, that's it. And they worked on it for 30 years, and it's a massive thing that they did. But this was a choice. It has been researched that it was a choice. This was not luck. That was a choice. And the second thing is, when you make a choice, you actually need to stand for it. So you need to become known for something. So I'll ask the question now so you can think about it, but I'll have some ideas, just how that would play out. But what do you think Iceland stands for today in the international economy? And the way the international economy will think about it is not 4 bullets, just one. You might be able to just get 2 in. At best 3. Countries, now Silicon Valley, it's a big place, a very big place. I think Silicon Valley has 2 messages. Tech, innovative, that's about it. That's what they stand for. Shanghai, what does it stand for? High rises, growth, but that's it, it's 2 things. Singapore, some funny dictatorial, but still pretty good government. And they get an outcome. But the next detail of that, actually, very few people know what that is. So it's actually, when you choose, you have to be selective, but then you need to find a way what you stand for. And my guess is your answer on what Iceland stands for today is not something you want it to stand for today in total. There's some things, of course, that are good there. So when you select, and you want to focus on exports, one first thing that you need to look at is, are these products tradable? If they're not tradable, they can't be exported. So one way to look at industries is, to choose industries is tradable things. In that is resource intensive, resource cluster, R&D intensive manufacturing, basic manufacturing is to the right-hand side, while local services and infrastructure is not. Then, if you can't differentiate the product, that's also quite hard, because you're a small place in a big ocean. Without differentiation, people will not recognize what you stand for. So on the vertical axis, R&D intensive manufacturing would make more sense than basic manufacturing, because in R&D there's a knowledge component to it. You could focus on it and get a return. There could be IP in it. Business services would there, resource cluster R&D could be there. And in the spectrum of resource industries, there could be some that actually have this aspect and some that have it less. So I think this is one thing to focus on. In the next, I'm talking a little bit about what does Iceland stand for, but I do it by illustration of a few towns that I know that have the size of Iceland. And they're all in my country, so you probably don't know them all enough, and they're not strong enough in what they stand for. But Amsterdam with 808,000 people stands for business service and tourism. Everybody in business knows that tax in Amsterdam is low, and you can get it organized. Rotterdam stands for Port and Global Trade. The Hague is the city for world law. Not known enough yet, but they now have 4 international courts, which in total create 17,000 jobs. So the entire export targets that we talked about, just with the 20,000 jobs, this is an international service, because this is 17,000 people providing law to the world. Whether you like it or not, it's a different question. The Americans still don't like it. In Eindhoven, the headquarters of Philips was eradicated, and the good news of that was that all of a sudden there were 20 startups that all wanted to do tech. And Eindhoven now stands for an electronic city. Then there's lots of cities that have reasonable size, Tilburg, Groningen, Almere, Breda, that I don't think you've ever heard of, stand for nothing, and Nijmegen is trying Cancer Institute. But I also would want to tell you that Wageningen, at 37,000 people, so you don't need to be that big, is known in the agri-food sector as one of the leading places where science on agri-food is done. And of the 1,000 students per year, 500 students are international, because this is the place where you learn this. And the reason why I'm not saying is that I'm not picking these cities because they get it right. That's not my point. The question is, what's that question mark for Reykjavik, or what's that question mark for Iceland? What does it stand for? And 2 bullets is better than 3. And that's hard, because then you need to make a choice. And I think very few places stand for something else than more than two or three things. Now, the very big places like New York maybe can carry a 3rd or a 4th thing. So what do you stand for? Now, then, if you look at the places that have achieved a focus and have achieved something they stand for, that took a lot of courage, leadership, and effort. That didn't happen haphazardly. Silicon Valley didn't come out of nothing. That was a concerted effort across many places with lots of communication and accountability from, as I will say here, the macro world, the policy world, and the business world coming together. Stanford was in there, California State was in there, the US defense industry was in there that wanted to diversify, the business world was in there in many, many ways. But this was a concerted effort of a group of people that maybe like yours that said, this is what we stand for, this is the focus that we've chosen, and within that focus, we're going to over-index on that and make it happen. And then, smaller places can get big in a certain area. So the suggestion for you is to say, what is that focus and what does Iceland stand for, so you can pull the exports out and can pull the world towards that center of gravitas. When we sat together yesterday, Clemens and I, we thought about, would we check in advance how you would vote? And this laptop has stood there all the time while I was doing the speech. I have not touched it, so there's no programming going on. But I have to give Clemens credit, because he knows you and I don't, that he got the second one, I think. He flipped the first and the second one, I think. Because the facts were a little bit weaker. You actually like 2 or 3% as a goal. The plan is a question mark, and therefore you don't implement the changes. If I could just make one suggestion for you to unlock Iceland's growth potential, get a plan. What do you stand for? What do you focus on? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. We'll now open for questions. There's a mic on the floor, and I want to make your questions brief and state your name for the record. Yeah, we'll start here in the front. Ég ætla að fara að múta ykkur, kemst ekki í kaffi nema kemur spurningar.
So this was a tour de force in some sense. I am Mark Gunnarsson, the governor of the Central Bank of Iceland, and I have a question with a preamble. And the preamble is the following. I have the suspicion that there was a lot of confusion in the room when you asked people to vote on the implicit growth goal. Because I think that most people were thinking in terms of GDP overall, but I have a suspicion that you were thinking in terms of GDP per capita. But that doesn't matter. And then you said, okay, let's get the facts straight. And that is also very important for this country. What are the facts here? For 30 years, if you take a 30-year average, Iceland has been growing by 3.1%,
Yep.
so close to 3. And that is actually what it grew at last year. So the question is it realistic to go up on that? And if we have been growing at 3, then the implicit growth rate for GDP per capita is 1 to 2. Yeah. So I think we need to get that straight, and that's leading me to the question. I think that Iceland always wanted to grow much faster and was trying to do that through stimulating demand.
Yep.
And that is where we get all this instability. And I put the question to you, yes, it's good to have a plan, but is it better to have no plan than an unrealistic plan? Can we aim too high, and can that be risky? I ask you.
Of course, you can aim too high, and in particular, monetary policy, you can do that. I'm kidding, but I think one thing that is implicit in the question was the GDP per capita versus total GDP. I think is a good point, and I would say that the difference between the 1 and 2 and the 3 of the past was immigration, or was population growth, or was labor participation growth. In the Western world, on average, half of that was immigration, half of that was labor participation. In Iceland, how much was immigration?
Over the 30-year period, mostly nothing immigration. So,
okay.
So it's not.
It was labor participation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So the question is, do you want to work more hours? Is female participation in the labor force go up? And that model has to shift a little bit if you want to continue a 3% growth path. I didn't say 4 or 5 as a growth aim, but why would you not, if you did 30 years 3, why would you not try another 30 years 3? So I think shooting for 4, 5, or 6 in a mature market is a little bit different. But above 2, I think is for me a reasonable aim, as long as you buy into the idea that the next generation should be better off, and you want to alleviate poverty. And for that, I think below 2 it gets complicated. And so and I agree, unrealistic targets make no sense. Too focused and creating bubbles in an area where the supply is not there also doesn't make sense. So this is not the plan has to be careful. That for sure. Yep.
Thank you for an interesting lecture. My name is Árni Páll Árnason. I'm the leader of the opposition Social Democrats. You mentioned the lack of a plan, of course, and the show of hands illustrated very clearly that there is a lack of plan. I would, of course, claim that one of the reasons is that we have a government currently that has no clear currency plan.
Clear what?
No plan on the monetary framework.
Okay.
But without dragging you into Icelandic party politics, I just want to ask you another question. Is it a realistic prospect for a country to grow in the international sector without a firm framework for monetary policy that ties in with our closest export markets? Is it possible to operate a floating currency without then very, very strong limits and gain the benefits that you are talking about of being a truly an economy that's truly focused on growth in the international sector?
I'm trying to recall where the negatives and the positives in all your question was, but I think you can be prosperous without being in the EU. You can be prosperous with a floating currency. You also cannot. So I don't think the regime. You cannot be prosperous without trust of the international society in what you're supposed to do, what you're going to do. I think if you are credible for multiple years in a floating currency non-EU system, it works. No, Switzerland works. Floating currencies inside the EU have worked. So I don't think the principle is the issue. It's can you gain the trust. Now you then have everybody can have their own considerations whether the easiest way to gain trust is by joining the EU or not. That I leave up to each individual. But to me, that's a different question. I think there's no fundamental reason why floating currencies couldn't work or why, being part of the EU or not is the major difference maker. But that is at the end more a how do you do the change choice rather than a fundamental one.